Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our discussion of the United States and the Cold War. In the previous lecture, I discussed the memorable election of 1948 and Harry Truman's remarkable victory in that election. I concluded by noting that while he was able to win the election in 1948, within just a few months, Truman's popularity began spiraling once again, ultimately to historic lows. So in this lecture, we turn to those months after the election of 48 and some of the events that led to Truman's spiraling popularity. After Truman's re-election, discussions of the NATO treaty resumed. These were pushed especially by Secretary of State Dean Acheson, perhaps the most important policymaker of the early Cold War. He had been a hot young lawyer in Washington, D.C., who was brought into politics by FDR. He quit for a time and then returned during World War II. He was a staunch anti-communist and hardliner when it came to winning the Cold War. In April of 1949, the Soviets began lifting the blockade in Berlin, and at the same time, there were meetings to discuss the NATO treaty. Ultimately, 12 nations joined the original NATO treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in April of 1949, including the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, Italy, and the Nordic nations, among others. This organization called for collective security and was, in a way, a militarized form of the United Nations. The atomic bomb formed the backbone of this security. There was little intention of sending traditional ground forces. The nations pledged to use force only in self-defense. Article 5 was perhaps the key article in the NATO Charter, and one of the more controversial aspects of it. It stated, "The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that each of them will assist the party or parties so attacked." There were those who thought that this created what George Washington had described as an entangling alliance way back after the very first presidency. I'll discuss this idea more in just a moment. All involved agreed that the power of NATO was to create not merely a balance of power, but a preponderance of power. That is, the NATO group together should be more powerful than any rival could possibly present. However, some questioned whether NATO really added much to the position already as it stood, as the United States possessed the atomic bomb and thus by itself held a preponderance of power. In another clause of the NATO treaty, the military response of each nation was to be conducted within each nation's constitutional process. That meant in the United States that Congress would still have to be consulted before declaring war, and thus it really wasn't an entangling alliance, as some might have thought. As one NATO critic pointed out, though, the Soviets could potentially launch an attack and take much of Europe before we could ever get Congress together to declare war. So practically speaking, this military alliance was not overwhelmingly powerful. More importantly, Acheson and others believed that these nations needed to be aligned to the United States by treaty, simply to prevent them from drifting in other directions. It was yet one more way for the United States to influence and perhaps control the nations involved, a militarized version of the Marshall Plan. The Senate ratified the NATO treaty by a vote of 82 to 13 in mid-July of 1949. Truman sought a $1.5 billion aid package to fund NATO. The aid package was debated in Congress until September and appeared in jeopardy of not passing until Truman announced on September 22nd that the Soviets had exploded an atomic bomb, and it passed almost immediately after that. With that Soviet test of the atomic bomb in 1949, the global situation changed dramatically. As one scientist working on American bombs commented, the Russians can affect the political attitude of Western Europeans just by threatening to bomb them. As a result, Truman ordered that work on the hydrogen bomb, the H-bomb, be accelerated. This would be an immensely more powerful weapon than the atomic bombs. Some criticized the Truman administration for this project, including some of the scientists who had been central in developing the original atomic bomb. What is the need for a bomb so powerful that it can lead only to the destruction of the world? This was not a military weapon, but a weapon of genocide and utter destruction. We'll return to discussions of the hydrogen bomb later in the course. The Truman administration was also criticized by some for its China policy, and the loss of China to communism may very well have been the biggest blow to the Truman presidency in his second term. A growing body of supporters in Washington of Chiang Kai-shek came to be known as the China Lobby. These were folks who thought that Truman needed to do more in supporting Chiang in China, and so they were critical of his policy there. As I discussed in previous lectures, though, Chiang was not a stable man. He was corrupt and continually making demands of the Americans. But the United States insists that the Soviets were supporting Mao. And so if we alienate Mao in support of this other character that we don't like. So they thought we needed to support Chiang because the Soviets were supporting Mao. By 1948, the China lobby was growing in influence. Some leading captains of industry were concerned that Truman was sacrificing China to the communists and not doing enough to stop it. Many Americans questioned why the United States, the greatest military power in the world, was standing by and watching Mao defeat Chiang. Most Americans understood little about how difficult it would be to prevent Mao from prevailing. The next logical step, and many Americans began to believe it, was that there must be a communist conspiracy in the State Department that was preventing us from assisting Chiang. I'll return to that idea in a future lecture. In 1948, Truman asked Congress for $570 million to support Chiang. He got Congress to give them $400 million, which was enough to alienate Mao, but not to make Chiang happy, and ultimately not enough to prevent Mao's victory. The money seemed to do nothing at all. Critics argued that we needed to send more. Others in the Truman administration were ready to completely cut off Chiang. Acheson argued that more aid would not solve the problem. He reported that these military debacles can all be attributed to the world's worst leadership and many other morale-destroying factors that lead to a complete loss of the will to fight. By February of 1949, Chiang's nationalist forces had lost half their troops, and 80% or more of the supplies and weapons sent by the United States had fallen into communist hands. By April, Truman advocated completely cutting off aid. The China lobby responded with its most vocal criticism yet. Truman and the State Department replied with the China White Paper. Acheson wrote the lengthy introduction. This was over 1,000 pages of documents that ultimately was published for everyone in the country to read. The White Paper defended Truman's actions and said in part, "The unfortunate but inescapable fact is that the ominous result of the Civil War in China was beyond the control of the government of the United States. It was the product of internal Chinese forces, forces which this country tried to influence but could not." The China lobby responded with harsh criticism of the Truman administration, saying, quote, "The white paper was a whitewash of a wishful do-nothing policy, which has succeeded only in placing Asia in danger of Soviet conquest." The problem was that the United States interpreted the China issue within the context of the United States and Soviet Cold War. They didn't recognize the appeal of Mao himself to the people of China and couldn't back off from support of Chiang and admit a mistake. In October of 1949, Mao was successful, establishing the People's Republic of China. The United States had lost China, which would play a big role in the next major international crisis in Korea, which I'll discuss in a future lecture. The United States didn't recognize Mao's government, wouldn't trade or negotiate with them. Instead, the Truman administration, pressured by the China lobby, reluctantly recognized a rival government formed by Chiang in Formosa, which would later become Taiwan. In the meantime, in November 1949, Mao headed off to Moscow to negotiate with Stalin, though a friendly alliance was not as certain as many in the United States believed. In Russia, these developments sparked a debate about the future directions of Soviet policy. The fall of China to communism and the Soviet detonation of the atomic bomb seemed to indicate that Russia was winning the Cold War. Some in Russia argued that the Western powers were crumbling and that its policies did not need to be aggressively expansionist. The West would crumble on its own, even without greater pressure from Russia. Stalin was not so ready to assume victory and proceeded with caution. His talks with Mao were delicate and produced little. Each side offered some assistance to the other. The Soviets offered China a loan of $300 million over 5 years and offered to consult with China should China be attacked by Japan or anyone else. The Soviets surrendered their special rights to ports and railways in Manchuria. But the talks were not warm. Let's remember that back during World War II, Stalin had agreed to negotiate with Chiang and not with Mao. Stalin remained more concerned with his own agenda, not terribly concerned about establishing a tight relationship with China. And he was just fine if China had internal problems of its own. In one exchange between Stalin and George Kennan, Kennan recalled, "One of our people asked them what they were going to give to China when the war was over, and Stalin snorted contemptuously and said, in effect, 'What the hell do you think we can give to China? We have 100 cities of our own to build in the Soviet Far East. If anybody is going to give anything to the Far East, I think it's you.'" And I think, Kennan concluded, he was speaking quite sincerely. In the United States, the fall of China was incredibly divisive. Many in Congress used it as a point of criticism of the Truman administration. For its part, the administration argued that the fall of China to communism was both inevitable and not such a crushing blow. Acheson argued that nationalism in China trumped communism, and that the American position in the rest of Asia remained strong. Still, the Chinese-Soviet alliance, such as it was, coupled with the explosion of the Soviet bomb, the divisions in the American Congress, and debates over NATO, made late 1949 a difficult time for Truman. As it turned out, early 1950 would be no better. The early weeks of 1940 saw a cascade of events that sent Truman's numbers spiraling and also created a sense of urgency so far unseen in the Cold War. In early 1950, the infamous Alger HIST trial concluded and was front-page news for weeks. It concluded that HIST had been guilty of perjury. We'll talk about the HIST trial in more detail later when I talk about a number of spy cases during this period. But in short, you should know now that Hiss was considered an impeccable citizen and upstanding member of the State Department who had been accused of passing State Department documents to the Soviets. As it turned out, Hiss had been a spy, and he was deemed guilty, creating the sensation that if Alger Hiss was a spy, anyone could be a spy. And in part, this sets off some of the spy mania and the Red Scare that I'll talk about in a future lecture. In rapid succession, in early 1950, a series of events seemed to suggest that the Cold War was slipping away from the United States. On January 14th, there was an attack against the American consulate in China. On January 21st, the Hiss verdict came down, indicating that he had been a spy. On January 31st, Truman announced the order to build the hydrogen bomb, which was met with much criticism. Albert Einstein commented, "Annihilation of any life on Earth has been brought within the range of technical possibilities." On February 3rd, London announced that a top-level spy ring had been caught selling atomic secrets to the Soviets. And on February 9th, Joseph McCarthy made a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and announced that he held in his hand a list of 205 communists currently working in the State Department, thus setting off the Red Scare. We'll talk more about the spy cases and McCarthy and the rest of these issues in future lectures. For now, understand that all of these developments led Truman and the White House to feel that the Cold War was crumbling. He demanded a wide-ranging study of American Cold War policies. The resulting study, called NSC 68, would be brought to Truman and other officials in April. It would shape American policy for the next 20 years at least, and in some ways for the duration of the Cold War. It's to a discussion of that vitally important document that I'll turn in the next lecture.